true as our guide. With clarity on the mic, bringing light to the fight. Together we're ready, shining bright. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands. Exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene. Together we'll build a future strong and keen. We'll dive into the data, the numbers don't lie. Examining the challenges, reaching for the sky. Education, infrastructure, let's pave the way. With fiscal responsibility, we'll seize the day. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands. Exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene. Together we'll build a future strong and keen. Whoa, tune in every Wednesday, feel the vibe. For the stories and insights that we all prescribe. Plans, policies and programs we'll uncover. With every discussion, let's support one another. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands. Exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene. Together we'll build a future strong and keen. Don't dive into deeper, strong and keen. We'll dive into the data, the numbers don't lie. Examining the challenges, reaching for the sky. Education, infrastructure, let's pave the way. With fiscal responsibility, we'll seize the day. Behind me.
Good evening to you, Guyana, and welcome to Behind the Agenda. I'm your host, Cordell Jones, and this evening we're cutting through the noise and getting straight to the facts, from economic growth to expanding home ownership and tax reform. The government's progress under President Irfan Ali is undeniable. Despite attempts to distract from the truth, Guyana's tax to GDP ratio is now the lowest in Latin America and the Caribbean, a clear sign that burdens on working people are being eased while the economy grows. We've also seen unprecedented transparency and clarity around our oil and gas assets, as experts reaffirming that every fixed and movable asset from our petroleum sector belongs to the people of Guyana. Full stop, no spin, no misinformation. While others are trying to stir confusion about public finances or housing programs, we're here to tackle facts head on. This government isn't just talking, it's delivering results across every sector. So, as we dive into this evening's agenda, let's stay grounded in what matters: truth, transparency, and progress. As usual, joining us on the program, none other than Joel Bagwedin, who has been enlightening us about the finer details about some of these issues that we've been hearing in and around Guyana. Joel, good evening. Welcome to the program. Happy to have you here as usual.
Good evening, Cordell. Good evening, viewers. Thank you for having me once again.
So, Joel, let's jump right into it. Taxation, revenue reform. Let's start with taxation. The opposition claims Guyanese are being overtaxed, but you've pointed out that our tax to GDP ratio is the lowest in Latin America and the Caribbean. Can you break down that for the viewers? What does that really mean for the average citizen?
So thank you, Cordell, for starting off with that question. In responding to that question, I want to draw reference to an interpretation put forward on the same question by Mr. Lal Bachchan Christopher Ram in an invited commentary by the Kaito News. And he basically said that the low tax to GDP ratio is an indicator of reckless management by the government.
Wow.
Quite a strange interpretation of the indicator without him performing any degree of analysis to even ascertain whether the tax to GDP ratio that the institution
Mm.
arrived at, whether that was even correct, whether they took into account the evolving dynamics, the evolving structure of the economy, or whether it was just a simplistic calculation and whether he just gave a simplistic, uninformed interpretation.
Right.
Now, when you read the report, what really is a tax to GDP ratio and what really does it tell you? Now, for different countries, it will tell you a different story. That depends on the structure of that country's economy. And when you're doing these types of analysis, you have to accompany it with, so there's the quantitative analysis whereby you crunch the numbers, you work out, you calculate the ratio by using quantitative data. And to understand what that data means and how to correctly interpret that data, you have to also perform what is called a qualitative analysis.
Mm.
If you don't do both, you're going to end up with an incorrect interpretation, as in the case of Lalbachchan Christopheram, and an incorrect conclusion. Now, some of the countries in Latin America that had lower levels of tax to GDP ratio, their ratio collapsed because of COVID, so they
Mm.
lost revenue.
Right.
Revenues, their tax revenue would have plummeted because of COVID. In our case, first of all, it's a bit different. The low tax to GDP ratio is because you've had double digit GDP growth over the last 5 years. Double digit GDP growth. So you have an exponential growth in GDP, hence you would have a low tax to GDP ratio because the rate of growth in the organic tax revenue would have been at a lower pace than the rate of growth in the economy,
Right.
right? So it doesn't mean that our revenue has collapsed. It doesn't mean our revenue has collapsed. Our GDP, if we look at a time period from, say, 2015 to 2024, our GDP has grown from 4 billion US dollars to over 20 billion US dollars. Over 20 billion US dollars. Our tax revenue has grown from, we were collecting at that time maybe about $200 billion. That's a billion US in tax revenue. That's excluding oil revenue. Now we're collecting maybe 400 billion and change. So
Mm.
our tax revenue has doubled. The tax revenue has doubled. That is excluding the oil revenue. Now, the ratio that these guys calculated, they did not take into account the evolution of the economy. They did a very simple calculation. They took the tax revenue and calculated as a percentage of overall GDP.
Mm.
Now, that would give you somewhat of a flawed or a distorted representation of the realities. Because if you're looking at only your tax revenue, you really have to look at your tax revenue in relationship to non-oil GDP. If you're
Okay.
looking at government revenue in totality, you have to look at government revenue in totality, which would include oil revenue in relation to overall GDP. They
Mm.
did not do that type of analysis. They did a very simplistic analysis, and therefore it was really distorted. So if you look at now, I have calculated the ratios, and I'll tell you what it was in 2015, and I'll tell you what it was in 2024. So in 2015, the tax to GDP ratio was 80%, right? Now that is before oil. That was before oil was captured in GDP, and that was before we captured oil revenue. In 2024, the tax to overall GDP ratio is 9%. And that's what you're looking at. It's 9%. But if you look at the tax, then the tax revenue to non-oil GDP, it's 25%. And if you look at gross revenue, revenue in totality, which is your tax revenue plus your oil revenue, it's 19% of GDP, which is not far off from where it was in 2015, which was
Right.
18% of GDP. Now, so they had to make you have to make some adjustments and some correction. So, so how do we interpret that indicator? The interpretation is that if you look at it regionally, we are still among the lowest. So what does it mean? Does it mean we're losing revenue? No, the highest, I think Brazil has the highest tax to GDP ratio of 31% or 33% of GDP. We are still, if you look overall, we're 19% of GDP. We're less than 25, less than a quarter of GDP. Now, it does not mean when you really do the qualitative analysis to accompany the quantitative element of the analysis, it is not that revenue has collapsed. Revenue has grown. Tax revenue has doubled. Tax revenue alone has doubled. But it is an indicator, a positive indicator, that we're able to achieve exponential growth in GDP and still having been able to double our growth in revenue collection on account of a lower overall tax environment. Because from 2020, since the government came into office, PPPC government, they have, first of all, into 2020 budget, the emergency budget, they reversed a series of taxes and fees that would have that the APNU AFC would have implemented in their tenure that resulted in an additional collection of taxes, which means an increase in the tax burden by nearly $100 billion. By nearly $100 billion, they've increased the tax burden. In this case, we have been able to collect more taxes by lowering taxes. And by lowering taxes, we are able to collect more tax revenue, although we have lower taxes. Because when you lower taxes, when you lower taxes to incentivize growth, to support expansion of the economy, to incentivize and job creation, companies in turn make the investment, they generate more revenue, and when you make more revenue you make higher profits, and when you make higher profits you pay more taxes. And that is a positive achievement. So if you do a proper analysis, not an emotive commentary as was preferred by Lal Bachchan, Christopher, you do a proper objective professional analysis, you do the quantitative, you do the qualitative, this is the interpretation you would arrive at. It is a positive indicator, although I think it's ECLAC or IDB did that report. Although they did not do it correctly necessarily, they didn't take into account the evolving structure of the economy. I have made the adjustments. I did a different calculation, and I've been explained it to you. We're still among the 19% of GDP is still among the lowest within the region, and it means we have a low tax burden environment. We've lowered the tax burden on the people, on the business sector, the private sector, as well as the household individuals, and that has still yielded in growth in revenue collection. That is a positive indicator for any country.
Right, right. Now, Joel, I want to bring your attention to ownership of our oil and gas assets. There has been some confusion about who owns Guyana's petroleum assets. The government says the assets are 100% state-owned. can you talk us through the facts? Who exactly owns the FPSO's vessels and infrastructure?
So this is an issue that that has been yeah, this is an issue that has been in the public domain by a certain media house for a long time.
Mm.
For a long time, the interpretation out there by the Kaicho News, more so Kaicho News publisher, wannabe presidential hopeful, is that the assets, everything that the oil companies operate belong to Guyana, owned by Guyana because it is financed by cost oil, and cost oil comes from the revenue generated from the sale of our crude. Is that a correct interpretation? And the answer is simply no. If you read Article 20 of the Petroleum Agreement states once those assets, the cost of acquisition of those assets have been fully recovered, when the contract expired, upon the expiration or termination of the contract, whatever asset has been fully recovered, cost recovered, those assets, according to the terms of the contract, shall be handed over to the government or transferred to the government, which means at that point in time, the ownership of those assets become state assets. But the key point here is upon the expiration of the contract or
Mm.
termination of the contract. So it is similar to something called a boot arrangement. Boot, BOOT,
Build,
build,
own,
own,
operate.
operate, transfer.
Right, right.
Now, in a build, own, operate, transfer arrangement, which is a form of a public-private partnership model, you invite a private sector entity to invest in a project. Say, for example, the hydropower project, the Amila Falls, that was abandoned, and the
Wasn't
government.
Burmese River Bridge something like that? That kind of arrangement?
No, that was a different. That's a
Oh.
slightly different model. But the Amila Falls was a similar model. So the Amila
Mm.
Falls, and this is why you would recall that the opposition often propagate that the Amila Falls would have saddled the country with debt, and the government in defense says no, that they don't understand the model. So it was a boot model. In a
Mm.
boot, own, operate, transfer model, the private sector entity who would be the contractor would design and build the facility. They would also fund the facility. So the private entity would be responsible for arranging the funding, whether they have to borrow, whether they raise it through debt and equity. They would arrange that funding on their books, not the government, not on the government's books. They would arrange the funding, they would finance it, design it, build it, finance it, and they will own and operate it for a period. And the period
Mm.
is usually, it's a long-term period, usually 20 years. And after 20 years, when that period expire, which means the contract comes to an end after 20 years, then then they would transfer the facility, which include all of the assets and the ownership of all of the assets, in the control and ownership of the government or the state. So it's similar to that model. The assets right now, the contract is still, it's still an active contract. Expiration is yet, it has not been terminated. So all the assets that are owned and operated by the oil company, by the operator Exxon, are the property of the oil companies until it expired or terminated. Then is when Article 20 kicks in and the transfer of ownership of those assets will take place. So that is the key element that has been overlooked so far by those who have been propagating this idea that it belonged to Guyana.
Now, for those who may not understand, what role does Exxon or its consortium's partners play in the ownership and operation of offshore infrastructure, and how does that differ from ownership the the actual oil being extracted?
If I understand the question correctly, how does the
The,
ownership of the assets by the consortium differ from the ownership of the oil?
right,
What's the difference? Okay. So let me see how best I could explain this without confusing the viewers. The assets of the company, the consortium, those are the property of the company. They're on the books of the company, their financial books, their balance sheet, not on
right,
the government books. The crude oil is a natural resource of the state, of the country. We don't have the resources to first of all find it. We don't have the resources to go and discover the resource, go and prove to prove the value and the volume of the resource, whether it's commercially viable or not, to determine whether it's commercially viable or not. And we don't have the resources to develop it, to extract it, produce it, extract it, and then monitor. We don't have the resources. So what we did, we contract a group of companies called this consortium to do that. So the crude oil is owned by the state, but they have been contracted vis-a-vis the petroleum agreement. So if you read the agreement, they are referred to in that agreement as the contractor.
right,
And this contractor is made up of these three companies that form this consortium. And of these three companies that form the consortium, who is referred to as the contractor, contracted by the government, they have an operator. And the operator among themselves is ExxonMobil. So Hess is not the operator, CNOOC is not the operator. Exxon is the operator, one operator, and collectively they're the contractor to develop
right,
these resources and to extract it. So the resources belong to the country, but and everything else is governed by the terms and conditions of that contract.
right,
Of course, they had to now, so it's our resource. The crude belong to Guyana, but we can't go and say, you're going to give us all of it, because we contracted them and there is a cost for that contract. The cost for that contract, or for contracting this entity, or the cost for the contractor, is they have to come in and put their own money. They have to go and explore and find the resources. And if it was unsuccessful, they lose. We don't share the loss.
right,
If it was unsuccessful, and whether it's 400 million, they put their money to find our resources. And if they lose, it's their loss. That is
right,
in accordance with the terms and conditions of the contract vis-a-vis the petroleum agreement. If they win, they found enough resources, then the contract terms dictate how revenue would be shared, how they would recover their costs, because recognizing they had to put in their own money up front to develop, to explore and develop. So in the terms of that contract, the revenue sharing and the royalties and so forth are governed by those contractual terms arrangement.
okay.
I'm not
Now, I want to
that
take your
clearing
attention
up.
to that's. I want to turn your attention to public spending. So, some critics are saying that the government is spending recklessly. You have argued that This is structured, responsible investment in growth and welfare. Can you shed some light on how public spending is being managed, especially with the influx of oil revenues?
The, for the most part, the general public often do not pay attention to things like the audited general reports and so on. The thing is, all these questions touching and concerning public finance, public expenditure, whether it's being expended in a careful manner, in a prudent manner, or a reckless manner, the general public does not have to rely on someone named Lalbachan Christopher Ram or the opposition to tell them that we're spending money recklessly. They can do their own assessment. And I will give you the most simplistic answer to the question. If you're saying that there is reckless spending, now we can debate from now till February about whether government spending is prudent or reckless. We can debate from now till February. But if you take a look, just read the executive summary and the summary of each section in the Auditor General report. Those, I think the latest Auditor General report is 2023 under this government that is publicly available and that was tabled in the National Assembly. And you take that, you read that, and then go and read the General report during the 2020, the 2015-2020 period under the APNU EFC. You don't have to be an auditor, an accountant, or a financial analyst to understand how to read such a report. You quickly recognize that there has been qualitatively a marked improvement in the administration of public expenditure. There has been a marked improvement in breaches of the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. That was a norm under the APNU AFC. Those numerous breaches have been contained, minimized. The level of compliance with the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act has significantly improved. And in general, accountability of public expenditure has been markedly improved. You just read the executive summary.
Right.
So don't take my or what I'm saying to you, or don't listen to a Lalbachan Ram or whoever. Just go and read those reports. Just go and read those reports. Right? And I'll give you another explanation. Look at the public expenditure. Look at the orientation of public expenditure on the APNU-AFC and under the PPPC administration. Under the APNU-AFC, they expended more resources. They cut the capital budget by 20 percentage points. They cut the capital budget by 20 percentage points and increase the consumption budget, the recurrent budget, by 25 percentage points. And what does that mean? They were spending more money on food, spending more money on insurance and that type of stuff, travel, a whole range of recurrent expenditure, unsustainable. Those are what I call excesses. Right. The excesses on themselves were amazing. Were amazing. That is what you call reckless spending. What are we spending on now? All those excesses have been cut, and we are now spending on investment in building out the economy, building out infrastructure, building out healthcare, building out the education sector, investing in improving how the government delivers public service in terms of investing in a digital infrastructure
Mm.
that they have already started. They talk about a digital ID card, the integrated system. Look, just look at the airport. I don't know when last you traveled, but just
Mm.
look at the integration system now to when you're traveling, how that has improved in terms of these are investments to make our lives easier. So you just take a look at those couple of things and see where the money is really spending and where the results, how your life is impacted, and then you determine what is reckless and what is not reckless.
Right. Now, Joel, moving to housing and social programs, we've seen a major expansion in home ownership under this administration. In your view, how has the government managed to achieve that scale while maintaining affordability?
How has the government managed to achieve? Sorry, repeat the question for me.
So we've had an expansion in home ownership under the Irfan-led administration, right? Explain to us how the government has been able to manage to achieve the high increase of persons being able to own their own homes and afford their own homes. You understand?
So it was not, it was not by luck and chance. It was not an experiment, and it was not by accident. It The results that we've seen were achieved or are achieved because of intentional, deliberate policies of the government, a a housing policy, a comprehensive housing policy and housing drive that they have tested and proven and perfected, not in this term, but
Mm.
in previous terms. In the previous uh, term, pre 2015, they've had a successful housing policy. And this policy is not just the opening of new schemes, development of new housing area, and building, distributing house lots, and building new homes. Because you could develop 100 housing schemes and develop and distribute 50,000 house lots. But if people can't afford to purchase the land and can't afford to build, then you can't say that you have a successful housing policy.
Right.
So the question of affordability in home ownership is or has been achieved because of a deliberate policy designed by the government. And what is that policy, or what are the key features of that policy? The key features of that policy is, first of all, you have to make it affordable. The government designed a policy to whereby the financial sector was incentivized to offer below market rate housing loans. And
Right.
how they do that? On the interest earned on the taxes paid and interest earned from home mortgages. The government said to the Bankers Association, we will remove the taxes. So by removing the taxes paid and interest earned, the banks were incentivized to lower their rates from the market rate, which is about 12-15%,
Right.
to as low as 5%. As low as 5%. That is way below the market term. That's almost 10 percentage points on average below the market rate. So home ownership was made affordable as a result of this first policy to incentivize the banks to offer low cost loans as low as 5%. That's the first, the first feature. Targeting low income, middle income, and of course, high income, they can take care of themselves. More so, a policy designed to target your low income families, and this
Right.
policy has proven successful since the vice president was president, since during his tenure as president. The second feature of the policy, the affordability element of it, is they then introduce something called the mortgage interest relief. So this mortgage interest relief, those who are eligible, and to be eligible, you have to meet two main conditions. One, you have to be a taxpayer. Your taxes have to be up to date. Most people are employees, and so they pay their PAYE, and therefore their taxes are up to date.
Right.
Most low income people are salaried people. So often their taxes will be up to date because they pay their PAYE. So you have to be up to date with your taxes. And two, you have to be a first time homeowner.
Okay.
If you already have a home and you're going to build a second home, the first home will be eligible, but the second will not. How you finance your second home or a second property will not be eligible for mortgage interest relief. So first-time homeowners, tax-paying homeowners, they're eligible for what is called the mortgage interest relief program. And so what that is, the interest that you pay on your home mortgage, and the average low income loan annual interest is about between 600 to $800,000 a year.
Mm.
Let's work with a lower number. Let's say 600,000. Your annual interest on a low income loan is about 600,000. So there's a low cost loan, and then you get interest free. So that means practically you're getting low income families or all first time homeowners, they are practically getting interest free loan to build their homes. Interest
Mm.
free. And that is why the housing policy has been successful, not just distributing house lots, but the policy of the government to make home ownership affordable.
Mm. Mm. What's your take on the strategic importance of linking housing to broader economic and social mobility?
Housing is an important piece of asset. When you, and it is an important wealth creation or facet of wealth creation and accumulation. The land is a piece of asset upon which the property is constructed. When you construct the property plus the land is is a complete asset, and both carries a market value. That market value, and especially in this current environment, tends to appreciate. It appreciates two times, three times. How does that translate to your increase of wealth? It translates not only in an accounting sense, whereby you show on paper that you have total assets worth this amount, but you can also leverage that asset to grow your wealth.
Mm.
You can leverage, you can borrow against that as you pay your mortgage, as you write down your mortgage, and as the value, the market value of the property increases, as you invest in yourself, as you develop yourself and increase your earning capacity and diversify your income streams, you can then leverage that piece, that asset, the value of that asset, to
Right.
borrow against it, to do something productive, whether it's a business, whether it's to finance the operations of a business, or whether to make an investment. And that's how you accumulate and grow your wealth. And so that's the importance or the strategic importance of owning a property, because you can leverage the value of the asset, you can leverage the market value of that asset to multiply your wealth, to
Mm.
multiply your wealth and
Right.
improve your own well-being and standard of living and so on.
Right. Now, taking you to some issues of transparency and public trust, we've been hearing a lot of talk about secrecy in government contracts and oil agreements. What mechanisms are in place to ensure transparency, and are they working as intended?
Cordell, the question of transparency, the stakeholders who oftentimes pose that question. In fact, let's identify one of them. Let's take the Transparency Guyana or whatever they call themselves. How transparent is that organization?
Hmm.
Is that organization, who are they accountable to, other than the international reporting body? Who are they? Transparency of what and to whom? They have never published a report. I don't know what is their governance structure, whether they're required to hold AGM, who are their stakeholders, what are the bylaws, how that institution is governed, how the finances of that institution is managed, the source of their finances, and whether they're required to publish annual reports. So before you come to me about transparency, look at yourself or look in the mirror first. So let me put that out there. These people who talk about transparency, these entities that advocate for transparency, they do not practice what they preach, and they themselves are not transparent, and they themselves, there are many, many question marks above them. On the question of transparency with respect to public trust, public administration, public governance, show me where transparency is lacking. Everything is public. How much money we earn, how much oil we produce, the chemical composition of the crude oil, public expenditure is public, the audit reports are public, the mining contracts are public, the oil contract is public. There are a bunch of reports that are in the public domain with a ton of information. I can recall that I think it was the GPA, the Guyana Press Association, complained bitterly about lack of transparency, that there is an information blackout and that type of stuff.
Mm.
And I recall that there was, remember the end of year press conferences by the various subject ministries?
Right.
So you had a presidential press conference, and then you had the ministerial press conference. Through those press conferences, volumes of documents of information, volumes of documents of information containing information were made public to the press, to the media. And if they carried 1%, that was too much. If they published 1%, that was too much. So on one hand, you have this fallacy of lack of transparency, but the information is placed in your hands. You do nothing with it, and then you complain, we don't have information. Information is there. So this thing of transparency, lack thereof, it's a fallacy. And not, be that as it may, not everything a government must make public too. There are certain sensitive information that cannot be made public. Take, for example, matters of national security. I see a lot of people, oh, Barajagdi only focusing on Mohammed and Azruddin and Melly Mel and them talking about what we doing in Venezuela and what's the plan. Those are things that you don't put in the public domain.
Right, I mean, I agree. Like
Those
you're gonna announce the plan, and then the
that
Venezuelans
you,
watch it on TV.
you don't conduct certain government business in the public,
Right, right,
especially of national security, and especially one that is an existential threat where we have to protect the integrity of our sovereignty, our territory.
right.
Those are things that you don't. What you want? You want the president to put out a dossier or a document that outlines what is the strategy, how we can deal with Venezuela, right? So certain things you
What we're
cannot
looking for.
in the public domain.
No, Joel. I want to take us to the ending of the program with this question. From a macroeconomic perspective, what are the biggest risks to the progress we've seen, especially with elections upcoming?
So I'm not sure if you mean what you mean by saying macroeconomic, because macroeconomic indicators. Our level of debt is
Well,
sustainable. Our reserve is growing and continues to grow. It's the highest historically. All of our macroeconomic indicators are historically the best indicators coming coming from where we came from historically, from a bankrupt country. We're macroeconomically sound and resilient, and we can withstand any externalities, any external adverse event, commodity price shocks, whatever external events.
let me
We are
change the
resilient
word.
enough. We
What do
are
you think is the
resilient enough to
difference to the
withstand any shock.
progress
Yeah.
that we've been seeing in this country, whether it
So
be infrastructure, whatever it is, especially with the elections upcoming?
right. So well, the progress that we've had could not have been achieved if we didn't have the macroeconomic environment that we have, the sound,
Right.
stable, resilient, strong macroeconomic environment. That progress was brought about because of the macroeconomic prudent management, fiscal management, etc., responsible fiscal management.
Right.
Heading into the election, and in the coming programs next week and on I will focus on oh, hold please. Somebody's there. Come in, please. Okay, false alarm. False alarm. It appears. So over the next coming episodes until election, I will dedicate those programs sector by sector, looking at each sector, what we have achieved against what the government promised in their manifesto. But for
Right.
now, as you have asked the question, I'll give you an overview. And the overview is that when you look at what the government campaigned on in 2020, what they say they will deliver, they have delivered above and beyond their manifesto promises. They have delivered above and beyond. They said that we're going to give you the bridge. The bridge is maybe 90% near completion. We said we're going to monetize the gas resources. We'll build a power plant. Although it has not been completed for many various reasons, it is a work in progress. The pipeline at least is complete. The development and the construction of the gas plant is complete. Hold on, give me one. Yeah, so the gas pipe is complete. The other facilities, the power plant and the other facilities are under construction. We said we'll deliver 50,000 house plots. We did housing that's been delivered. I think more than that. We said we'll target maybe 20,000 scholarship. We've exceeded that number. We said we'll make free education, tertiary level education free. We've delivered on that. We said we'll double old age pension. We've delivered on that. We said we'll restore the cash grant. We've delivered on that and more. We said we'll raise public servant salaries and look at remedying all the anomalies in the system. We have done that. So we'll do a deeper dive into every sector. But for now, and to conclude for tonight, an overview, the government has delivered above and beyond what they have promised through their manifesto. And I think going into the election, that alone shall guarantee a win, a victory at the upcoming election. No doubt about that.
Yeah, I was asking about what the biggest risk to that was, but
Oh,
let
the
me
biggest
give you another.
Oh,
Um,
oh.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
There is always risk. The materiality of those risks are not material enough to do any damage. And if you're referring to the newcomers who are vying president, if that is what you're referring to,
That's what I'm referring to.
if that is what I'm sorry you ask it at the end of the program, but we can dedicate a special program
No,
for that.
but let me ask something more specific.
But
Hold on
it
a
is.
second. No, for person, you understand financial things, how governments work and interact with each other. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, a sanctioned individual is elected president of this country, a country that has ties with the United States, and the United States has ties with almost all the countries around the world. What kind of impact you think that would have on Guyana and its ability to deal with
Well,
its outside partners?
I don't even want to deal with that hypothetical scenario because it will not happen.
Mm,
It would happen. So I will not entertain that.
mm,
But what I will say for now, and I'll be happy to maybe next week we can deal with this. This subject has to be dealt with by itself exclusively. Exclusively,
right.
we have to put aside all other topical issues and deal with this subject exclusively. What I will say for now is that this guy is an amateur in the political environment. He has committed a plethora of elementary errors that he doesn't know it, but that has worked against him.
Mm,
But the guy's ego is so massive that he doesn't have the brain power to back up his ego. And if your ego is bigger than your brain power to the extent that you can't back it up, you are going to implode and self destruct. Ego is a good thing, but you have to be able to back it up and you've got to be able to neutralize and manage and contain your ego. And you have to be calculated and you have to be smart and you, you have to operate in a manner that is shrewd.
mm,
No, those characteristics are alien to him. Those characteristics escape him, are running from him, or he's running away from them. The support that he believes he has, they think, right? They have a mentality that with money you could do anything.
mm.
That's not true. With money you can't do anything and have anything and control everything in your favor. It doesn't. The world doesn't work like that. The world doesn't work like that. If the world was working like that, then Elon Musk would have been the president of the United States And he would not have been resigning from that position, President Trump
Right.
asked the question why Elon Musk resigned. And the reason why he resigned, although it has not been something I've seen in the public a lot, but you would recall, I'm diverting a little bit to draw
Yeah.
some comparison here, draw some parallel here. I don't know if you recall, there was a leakage of a recording with the vice president, the United States vice president, questioning who the hell is Elon Musk, who he think he is. I am an elected member. I was elected by the
Right.
people. How is he calling the shots and how is he operating like if he's more powerful than me? I am the vice president, not him. You remember there is a recording, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There was a leaked recording with the United States vice president. Who the hell is Elon Musk? A few months later, Elon Musk resigning. Why?
Kick rocks.
Because Elon Musk is not a politician. Elon Musk is not a politician. He's a businessman. He might be the richest man in America. But you have to know your limitations. You have to know your boundaries. And in certain lane, you don't play. If you're
Right.
not a politician, stay in your lane. Because if you're going up against politicians who are seasoned in this business and who are deemed to be the best in the Caribbean, who took down a whole government that controlled the state,
Everything.
the military, the police, one man took down this whole government, a whole
Lord.
government. One man. The brain behind that, you won't go up against that man. Who the hell are you? You gotta be really, really stupid to think you could beat that man. You will never beat that man in your wildest dreams. 100 lifetimes, you will never be able to beat that man.
Boy.
So this, listen, let me leave that much.
You gotta get the full episode to talk.
We'll make a full episode to go into it.
Yeah. Joel, thank you for being here with us this week. Guys, we'll be here same time, same place next week as we continue this discussion on topical issues around Guyana's national interest. As usual, we'll have Joel here to break it down so we understand what's happening behind the agenda. Joel, take care. And to our viewers, again, join us next week, same time, same place on Behind the Agenda.
The agenda, dive into the agenda. Plenty of progress where every voice is in the program. From the ground down, around the clock to the oil and gas scene, together we'll build a future strong and keen. Strong and keen. Tune in every Wednesday. Feel the vibe of team. Stories and insights that we all prescribe. As policies and progress. Dive into the discussion. Let's support one another. In the heart of our nation, where voices collide, we're breaking down the policies with truth as our guide. With clarity on the mic, bringing light to the fight. Together we're ready, shine.